Marcus Chen gripped his boarding pass with calloused hands, the paper slightly crumpled from being held too tightly during his anxious walk through Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. It was 5:47 a.m., and the sky outside was still dark, that peculiar pre-dawn darkness that made everything feel suspended between night and day. He'd been awake since 4:15 a.m., unable to sleep despite working a brutal 12-hour shift at the warehouse just 8 hours ago. The alarm on his phone had buzzed while he was lying in bed in the tiny two-bedroom apartment he shared with his daughters, Emma, who was 8, and Sophie, who had just turned 6. He'd watched them sleep for a few minutes before slipping out, needing this escape, this chance to fly. At 42 years old, Marcus's face carried the deep weathering of sustained struggle. His hair, once jet black, was now streaked with premature silver, each strand a testament to the decisions that had brought him here. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes like bruises, the kind that didn't fade away with a good night's sleep because good nights of sleep were a luxury he couldn't quite afford. His hands, his flying hands, as he used to think of them, were now rough and scarred from years of warehouse work. Small cuts crisscrossed his knuckles. A chemical burn, long healed, had left a permanent mark on his left thumb. These were not the hands of a pilot anymore. They were the hands of a man who loaded boxes, operated forklifts, and cleaned machinery for $16 an hour. He wore his usual standby flight uniform, a faded Carhartt jacket that had seen better days, dark jeans with a small tear near the left pocket, and scuffed work boots. The leather was cracked in places, the soles worn unevenly from standing on concrete floors for hours. His t-shirt underneath bore the logo of a warehouse company he'd worked for 2 years ago. He'd run out of clean clothes to wear and had grabbed whatever was available in his laundry pile. Nobody in the airport would look twice at him, and they didn't. As he moved through security, TSA agents processed him with mechanical efficiency, barely making eye contact. A family of tourists rushed past him without apology, the father knocking his elbow slightly. A businessman in a three-piece suit glanced at him with the briefest flicker of judgment before turning away. Seat 12F was what Marcus always tried to get on standby flights. Middle seat, middle cabin, nowhere particularly desirable. That's what you got when you flew on employee standby privileges, the absolute bottom tier of the airline hierarchy. His ex-wife had kept custody of the kids and alimony payments, which meant his paycheck stretched impossibly thin. The standby benefit was one of the few ways he could afford to fly at all, and flying had become something he needed, not for adventure or vacation, but as a lifeline to remember who he used to be. As he settled into seat 12F on this particular morning, the cabin filled with a cross-section of humanity that largely ignored him. To his left sat a sharp-dressed businesswoman in her 50s, already typing frantically on her laptop, her manicured fingers clicking across the keyboard with aggressive purpose. She didn't acknowledge his presence even as he sat down. To his right was a teenager, probably 16 or 17, with expensive noise-canceling headphones already in place, a phone glowing in his hands. The boy didn't even glance up. Behind him, a couple argued quietly about a hotel reservation. In front of him, a woman with 2 young children struggled to stow her oversized carry-on in the overhead bin. Nobody stepped forward to help her, and Marcus considered getting up, but he was tired, and the world had trained him over the last 8 years not to volunteer for anything that wasn't explicitly asked of him. Marcus pulled out his worn aviation manual from his backpack, a battered copy of the F-22 Raptor Technical Specifications Guide that he'd kept through everything. The pages were dog-eared, the spine cracked from being opened hundreds of times. Certain passages were underlined, marked with faded yellow highlighter. This manual was his connection to a life that felt increasingly like a dream he'd once had. The photos of the sleek fighter jets seemed to mock him now, images of speed and power and purpose. He'd read this manual so many times that he could recite entire sections from memory. It was a form of meditation, A way to time travel back to when his biggest worry was whether his targeting systems were calibrated to military specifications, not whether he had enough money for his daughter's school lunches. The window seat in front of him was occupied by an elderly man who'd fallen asleep before takeoff, his head already resting against the window. Marcus looked past him to the tarmac outside, where ground crews in neon vests moved about with practiced efficiency. A baggage cart sped past. A fuel truck was being disconnected from another aircraft. The machines all worked perfectly, doing their jobs with mechanical precision. Marcus envied them in a strange way. They didn't carry emotional weight. They didn't wonder about paths not taken or sacrifices that might have been unnecessary. His mind drifted to his daughters as it always did. Emma would be waking up soon, getting herself ready for school while Sophie slept a little longer. Marcus had left cereal out on the counter and a note reminding Emma to pack Sophie's backpack. His mother, who lived 2 blocks away, would pick them up after school and watch them until Marcus got home at 6 p.m. It was a tight schedule, a choreography of survival that he'd perfected over 8 years. Emma had asked him last week why he worked so much. He'd told her it was because he loved them, but the truth was more complicated. He worked so much because the alternative, sitting still with his regrets, with the weight of his failures, was unbearable. He'd left the Air Force on good terms, technically. A medical discharge after a shoulder injury that had required surgery, 6 months of physical therapy, clearance to return to active duty. But by then his marriage was crumbling. His wife had given him an ultimatum: stay stationed in Nevada or come home to Arizona where her family was. He'd chosen his family. It was the right choice. He knew that. Emma and Sophie would never exist if he'd stayed in the Air Force. But sometimes, in quiet moments like this, on standby flights at 5:47 a.m., he wondered what his life would have looked like if he'd chosen differently. The boarding call came over the intercom, and Marcus folded his manual carefully, placing it back in his backpack next to a photo of his daughters from last Christmas. As he stood to join the queue, he straightened his jacket slightly, tucking his t-shirt in. He caught his reflection in the airport window, an invisible man, worn down, heading to D.C. for a conference he wasn't attending, just to fly and remember who he used to be. Nobody noticed as he walked past them into the jet bridge. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at 6:23 a.m., right on schedule. Marcus had settled into seat 12F, and the businesswoman to his left was already deep in her work, barely acknowledging the safety demonstration. The teenager to his right had cranked up his music so loudly that Marcus could hear the faint, tinny rhythm leaking from beneath the expensive headphones. The engine spooled up with that familiar whine that Marcus had heard thousands of times before, a sound that, despite everything, still made his heart race slightly. It was one of those sounds that his body recognized even when his mind tried to keep distance from it. The climb to cruising altitude took about 20 minutes. Marcus watched the Arizona landscape shrink beneath them, the geometric patterns of suburban development giving way to the vast desert that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. From this altitude, everything looked small and insignificant. Problems that seemed enormous on the ground became mere details, barely noticeable from 30,000 feet. Marcus had always loved that perspective shift. It was one of the things he missed most about flying, that ability to rise above the details and see the bigger picture. Up here, his warehouse job and his failed marriage and his financial struggles all seemed smaller somehow, less defining. The seatbelt sign chimed off at approximately 6:43 a.m., and passengers began shifting around. Some stood to use the restroom. Others pulled down tray tables and opened laptops. A flight attendant pushed a beverage cart down the aisle, asking everyone their drink preference in that automated, cheerful voice that sounded exactly like every other flight attendant he'd ever heard. Marcus declined coffee with a polite shake of his head. He didn't have the money to tip, and he felt awkward accepting anything while sitting in the middle seat wearing yesterday's t-shirt. It was about 30 minutes into the flight, just after the beverage service, when Marcus first heard them. 2 voices, masculine and confident, coming from 3 rows back and 1 seat over. Marcus's entire body went rigid. His attention, which had been drifting pleasantly across a magazine article about Arizona tourist attractions, snapped into laser focus. He recognized the cadence of their speech immediately. It was the particular dialect of military pilots. There was a precision to it, an economy of language that came from communicating in high-stress environments where brevity was essential. The fuel efficiency numbers on the new batch are actually showing 0.3% improvement over the previous variants, one voice was saying. Marcus didn't need to turn around to know these were experienced pilots discussing aircraft systems. The technical specificity, the casual confidence, it was unmistakable. His hands, which had been resting on his lap, suddenly gripped the edges of his seat. "No kidding," the second voice responded. "That's significant. What's causing the variance?" "Better combustor design, supposedly. They've been tweaking the engine parameters since the last retrofit cycle. The simulations show about 45 seconds less lag time on the throttle response, which could matter in certain tactical scenarios." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. F-22. They were definitely talking about F-22 systems. He knew that engine configuration intimately. He'd spent hundreds of hours studying those exact specifications, hundreds of hours sitting in the cockpit of a Raptor, feeling that responsiveness in his hands and feet. His entire nervous system was suddenly alive in a way it hadn't been in years. His shoulder, the one that had required surgery, suddenly ached slightly, a phantom pain triggered by emotional memory. He wanted to turn around. Every fiber of his being wanted to pivot in his seat, to see these pilots, to introduce himself, to reclaim some small piece of his former identity. But something held him back, a deep, ingrained sense of shame that he'd cultivated over 8 years of demotion and struggle. What would he say? "Hey, I used to do what you do, but I gave it up and now I work in a warehouse." How pathetic would that sound? These pilots, whoever they were living the dream that he'd abandoned. They were current, qualified in the system. He was a relic, a has-been, a man who'd made the wrong choice and was now paying for it indefinitely. He pulled out his aviation manual, opening it to a random page about thrust vectoring systems. It was a displacement activity, something to do with his hands and his mind to avoid turning around. But his ears remained completely attuned to the conversation behind him. "So when are you guys deploying next?" the second voice asked. "Officially 3 months, the first voice responded. "But there's been some talk about accelerating the timeline. We're hearing rumors about increased activity in the South China Sea, so who knows? Could be sooner. If that happens, I'm hoping I get paired with Rodriguez again. That guy's got an instinct for combat tactics that's honestly scary good. The simulation scores prove it." Marcus's chest tightened. Rodriguez. That was a common enough name, but something about the way it was said, with that particular tone of professional respect mixed with personal friendship, made him wonder. How many young Rodriguez pilots were there in the F-22 community? Hundreds, probably. It was statistically meaningless, and yet his mind latched onto it, spinning scenarios, wondering if this Rodriguez was someone he'd have known if he'd stayed in the system. The conversation continued. They discussed training protocols, upcoming exercises, changes to flight procedures. They talked about a senior officer who'd retired early, about budget cuts affecting maintenance schedules, about a particular simulator that was experiencing glitches. It was the kind of shop talk that Marcus could have participated in enthusiastically just 8 years ago. He would have had opinions. He would have known which maintenance issues were chronic problems versus new developments. He would have belonged to this conversation. But he didn't belong anymore. He was listening from the outside, like an archaeologist studying artifacts from a civilization he used to inhabit. His hands trembled slightly as he turned pages in his manual without actually reading the words. His eyes were trained on the printed text, but his entire consciousness was focused backward, on those 2 voices that represented everything he'd lost. The businessman across the aisle glanced at him, perhaps noticing his tension, then looked away. The teenager with headphones remained completely oblivious, lost in his music. Minutes stretched past. The conversation behind him gradually wound down as one of the pilots seemed to drift toward sleep. But those minutes had cracked something open in Marcus. All the careful compartmentalization, all the deliberate suppression of his former identity had been breached. Sitting in seat 12F, between a businesswoman typing furiously and a teenager lost in digital noise, Marcus suddenly felt the full weight of his choices. Not regret exactly. He loved his daughters too much to regret anything that had made their existence possible. But something like longing, mixed with grief for a version of himself that would never exist. He closed his aviation manual carefully and looked out the window at the endless blue sky stretching toward the horizon. The aircraft had been cruising for approximately 47 minutes when the turbulence began. It wasn't severe, nothing that would cause serious concern among experienced flyers, but it was noticeable. A pocket of rough air that made the cabin lights flicker slightly and caused overhead bins to creak. Most passengers didn't even look up. The businesswoman to Marcus's left didn't pause her typing. The teenager with headphones remained completely unaware, but Marcus felt it immediately, his body responding with the instinctive muscle memory of someone who'd spent thousands of hours navigating air currents. His hands gripped the armrests automatically, and for just a moment, he was back in the cockpit, feeling the aircraft respond to his inputs, reading the atmospheric data through his fingertips. The flight attendant's calm voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mild turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We expect this to pass momentarily." Standard protocol. Marcus had heard it 100 times from both sides, as a pilot in the cockpit and now as a passenger. The turbulence did pass, just as predicted, within about 90 seconds. But the disturbance had triggered something in the cabin. One of the pilots from 3 rows back, the one who'd been speaking so confidently about F-22 specifications, stood up to use the restroom. He was moving down the narrow aisle between the rows of seats, his flight suit catching slightly on the armrest of someone's seat. The aircraft lurched again slightly, just as he was passing Marcus's row. The pilot, trying to steady himself, accidentally bumped into Marcus's left shoulder with moderate force. It wasn't a violent collision, but it was enough to jostle him. "Sorry, buddy," the pilot said automatically, continuing toward the restroom. Marcus was about to respond with a standard "no problem" when something made the pilot pause. His eyes had fallen on the open manual in Marcus's lap, the F-22 Raptor Technical Specifications Guide, with its distinctive cover featuring a sleek fighter jet in profile. The pilot's eyes locked onto it for a fraction of a second, and Marcus watched as recognition flickered across his young face. He couldn't have been more than 35, probably younger. His flight suit bore captain's insignia, and there was a name tape that read RODRIGUEZ. "Hey," the pilot said, turning back slightly. His tone had shifted from polite apology to genuine curiosity. "You into aviation?" Marcus felt his throat suddenly dry. This was the moment he'd been both dreading and secretly hoping for during the entire flight. A chance to acknowledge his past, a chance to be recognized, but also a risk, the risk of being dismissed, of being seen as a washed-up has been clinging to nostalgia. He hesitated for approximately 2 seconds, which felt like an eternity. "Yeah," Marcus finally responded, his voice quieter than he intended. "A little bit." Captain Rodriguez's eyes narrowed slightly, his curiosity intensifying. "More than a little, I'm guessing, if you're reading that manual for fun." He smiled, and there was no judgment in it, just genuine interest. Most casual aviation enthusiasts go for the glossy picture books, not the technical specifications. Marcus felt something unlock in his chest. This young pilot was actually interested. He wasn't dismissing him or moving on. There was real curiosity here. "I used to fly," Marcus said quietly. The words felt strange in his mouth, like he was speaking a foreign language he'd once been fluent in but hadn't practiced in years. Really? Rodriguez's eyebrows rose slightly. What aircraft? Marcus took a breath. This was the moment of truth. F-22, he said simply. Call sign was Viper. Captain Rodriguez's expression transformed completely. His jaw actually dropped slightly, and his eyes widened with genuine shock and respect. No way, he said, his voice rising slightly in volume and pitch. You flew Raptors. No kidding. Several nearby passengers glanced over, wondering what the commotion was about. Marcus felt suddenly exposed, but he nodded. Yeah, quite a while ago. Rodriguez immediately forgot about his need to use the restroom. Instead, he sat down on the armrest of the seat in front of Marcus, technically a violation of FAA regulations, but nobody was paying attention, and the flight attendants were occupied with beverage service in the rear galley. His entire demeanor had shifted. He was no longer just a polite stranger. He was a fellow member of an exclusive club, someone who understood the significance of what Marcus had done. How many hours? Rodriguez asked eagerly. Somewhere around 1847 by the time I left the service, Marcus replied. The number came easily. He'd memorized it long ago. That's incredible, Rodriguez said with genuine admiration. What was it like, flying the Raptor? Marcus paused, considering how to answer. How could he possibly compress the experience of thousands of hours in the most advanced fighter jet in the world into a few sentences? It's like. He searched for the right metaphor, like becoming an extension of the machine. You stop thinking about the controls and just think about what you want to do. The aircraft responds so precisely, so quickly. It's almost like meditation and adrenaline at the same time. Rodriguez nodded, clearly understanding exactly what Marcus meant. That's what I'm always trying to achieve, he said. That perfect state where you're one with the aircraft. Some days I get there, and some days I'm still thinking about inputs and procedures. That takes time, Marcus assured him. And experience, you'll get there. They talked for another 5 minutes. Rodriguez asked about Marcus's deployment history, the types of missions he'd flown, how the aircraft had evolved since Marcus's flying days. Marcus found himself answering more openly than he had in years. It felt good to talk about this, to engage with someone who understood the technical and emotional dimensions of what he'd experienced. He explained some of the older systems in his manual, comparing them to the newer specifications that Rodriguez described. But eventually, nature called, and Rodriguez had to excuse himself to use the restroom. As he stood up, he placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder in a gesture of respect. Sir, he said, and the formality of the address made Marcus realize how young Rodriguez was, how deeply ingrained military courtesy was in him. Thank you for your service. Really. The work you guys did in those aircraft, it laid the foundation for everything we do now. That matters. Marcus felt his throat tighten. Thank you, he managed to say. That means more than you know. Rodriguez headed toward the restroom, but Marcus watched as he paused halfway, leaning down to speak with someone in the row behind. Marcus could see the teenager in that row, also wearing a flight suit. This must be First Lieutenant Kim, the other pilot who'd been part of the earlier conversation. Rodriguez was saying something to her, gesturing back toward Marcus. Sarah Kim's head turned, and she looked directly at Marcus with sudden, intense interest. Then both pilots looked at each other, and Marcus saw them exchange a significant glance. Whatever they were communicating in that moment, whatever recognition was passing between them, it felt important. Neither pilot was looking at him with pity or dismissal. It was something else entirely, something that made Marcus's heart begin to beat faster with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. He didn't know it yet, but his ordinary morning flight was about to become extraordinary. Marcus sat in his seat, trying to appear casual, but his mind was racing. He'd seen the exchange between Rodriguez and Kim. He knew something was happening, some kind of coordination between the two pilots. Part of him wanted to stand up and figure out what they were planning. Another part of him, The part that had learned over 8 years to keep expectations low and hope even lower, told him not to get his hopes up. They probably just wanted to chat more about flying, or maybe they were going to ask for some technical advice. That would be nice enough. He tried to return to his aviation manual, but the words wouldn't focus. His attention kept drifting to the activity happening throughout the cabin. He noticed Rodriguez returning from the restroom but not sitting back down in his original seat. Instead, the captain was speaking with one of the flight attendants, gesturing subtly toward the cockpit. Sarah Kim was doing something with her phone. There was definitely coordination happening here, but Marcus couldn't quite figure out what they were orchestrating. 21 minutes passed. The cabin had settled into that mid-flight quiet, passengers either sleeping, working on laptops, or staring blankly out windows. The businessman across the aisle had reclined his seat and closed his eyes. The businesswoman to Marcus's left had finally stopped typing and was now watching a movie on her laptop screen, the volume barely audible through her earbuds. The teenager to his right had shifted his body toward the window and appeared to be genuinely asleep, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. Then at approximately 7:34 a.m., everything changed. The intercom crackled to life, not with the usual announcements about beverage service or bathroom etiquette, but with the captain's voice. It had a different quality than the routine flight announcements. There was intention in it, deliberation. Several passengers looked up from their activities, curious about this unexpected communication. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, his voice carrying through the cabin with perfect enunciation, "I apologize for interrupting your flight. We have a very special guest aboard Flight 237 this morning, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge them." Marcus froze. His entire body went rigid. This couldn't possibly be about him. The businesswoman to his left pulled out one earbud, turning slightly to look around the cabin. The teenager suddenly stirred, his sleep interrupted by the intercom announcement. Several rows of passengers shifted in their seats, suddenly alert, wondering who this special guest might be. "We are honored to have aboard Major Marcus Chen, formerly of the United States Air Force," the captain continued. Major Chen served as an F-22 Raptor pilot, one of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. Marcus felt all the blood drain from his face. His hands began to tremble. He looked down, suddenly intensely aware of his scuffed boots, his torn jeans, his stained t-shirt. Around him, passenger heads were turning, looking for this Major Chen. The businesswoman to his left turned to look at him directly, her eyes widening with surprise. The teenager was now fully awake, staring at him with new interest. "Major Chen's service to our nation has been distinguished and honorable," the captain's voice continued. "And we also have aboard Captain Jake Rodriguez and First Lieutenant Sarah Kim, both active-duty F-22 pilots currently stationed at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada." There was a pause in the captain's narration, and Marcus realized this was orchestrated. Rodriguez and Kim had contacted the captain, had requested this public acknowledgement. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "Captain Rodriguez and First Lieutenant Kim," the captain said, his tone becoming more personal, warmer, "would very much like to extend their gratitude to Major Chen for his service, and for paving the way for their careers in the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. They have asked if we might create an opportunity for them to meet with Major Chen in person and express their appreciation." The cabin was now completely silent. Even the steady hum of the engine seemed to fade into the background. Marcus could feel every eye in the aircraft turning toward him. Some passengers were craning their necks to get a better look. An elderly woman 2 rows up was leaning into the aisle, trying to see him. A young father with 2 children was pointing toward the back of the cabin, presumably at Rodriguez and Kim, explaining to his kids what was happening. "Major Chen," the captain continued, "if you could please visit the flight deck after we've landed at Reagan National, we would like to make this introduction official. On behalf of everyone aboard this aircraft, I want to personally thank you for your service." The intercom crackled off. And then it started. Applause. It began slowly, almost hesitantly. The elderly woman too rose up, was clapping, and then the businessman who'd been sleeping suddenly woke up and joined in. Then more passengers. Within seconds, the entire cabin was filled with the sound of hands clapping. It wasn't overwhelming or thunderous, but it was genuine. People were standing up to get a better view. The teenager next to Marcus actually turned and smiled at him, giving him a subtle nod of respect. "That's cool, man," the teenager said quietly. The businesswoman to his left extended her hand. "Thank you for your service," she said simply, with evident sincerity. Marcus felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. His vision blurred. He tried to respond but couldn't find his voice. This was surreal. 30 seconds ago, he'd been invisible, just another tired man in worn clothes occupying a middle seat. Now, he was being publicly acknowledged and celebrated by an entire airplane full of strangers. A flight attendant approached him, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes. "Major Chen," she said, bending down slightly, "on behalf of the crew, thank you. We're honored to have you aboard." Marcus's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. Thank you, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything, sir," the flight attendant replied warmly. "Just enjoy this moment." The applause gradually faded as passengers settled back into their seats, but the energy in the cabin had fundamentally shifted. People kept glancing back at Marcus with curiosity and respect. An older gentleman in first class, visible through the cabin divider, gave him a thumbs up. A mother with 2 young children waved at him. Marcus sat there, overwhelmed by emotion. His hands were shaking. His face felt hot. For 8 years, he'd been invisible. He'd walked through airports unnoticed, worked in warehouses without acknowledgement, juggled 2 jobs and single parenthood while feeling like his life was a series of compromises and failures. But in this moment, at 37,000 feet, surrounded by strangers in a metal tube hurtling across the country, he was suddenly visible. He was suddenly seen. He mattered. The realization was so profound, so emotionally overwhelming, that Marcus had to excuse himself to the bathroom, where he sat in the tiny lavatory for 10 minutes and cried, not tears of sadness, but tears of release, of validation, of finally being recognized for something that had defined who he was. When he returned to his seat, Captain Rodriguez was waiting in the aisle, speaking quietly with Sarah Kim. They both looked at Marcus and smiled. Rodriguez mouthed the words, "You okay?" and Marcus nodded, unable to trust his voice again. Rodriguez gave him a thumbs up and returned to his seat. Marcus looked out the window at the endless blue sky and realized that everything had just changed. The landing at Reagan National Airport was smooth and professional, executed by the captain with the kind of precision that comes from thousands of hours of experience. Marcus felt the aircraft descend gradually, watching the landscape below transform from dense suburban sprawl to the distinct architecture of the nation's capital. The Potomac River snaked through the landscape like a silver ribbon, and Marcus could see the monuments in the distance. The Washington Monument rising above the cityscape, the Lincoln Memorial, the geometric expanse of the Pentagon across the river in Arlington. He'd been to D.C. before, but it had been years ago, back when he was still a captain in the Air Force, back when his future had seemed open-ended and full of possibility. The wheels touched down at 8:47 a.m. Eastern Time, and the aircraft decelerated smoothly. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Marcus found himself unable to sit still. His leg was bouncing involuntarily. His hands kept clenching and unclenching into fists. The emotional intensity of the last hour was catching up with him. He'd been acknowledged publicly, recognized by strangers, validated by people who understood what his service had meant. But now came the personal moment, the face-to-face meeting with Rodriguez and Kim that he'd been dreading and anticipating simultaneously. Around him, passengers were already gathering their belongings, pulling down carry-on luggage from the overhead bins, stretching after the 3.5-hour flight. The businesswoman to his left was shutting down her laptop and sliding it into her bag with practiced efficiency. The teenager was putting his headphones away and checking his phone, presumably turning off airplane mode so he could reconnect with the outside world. Neither of them acknowledged Marcus directly, but he noticed them glancing his way with residual curiosity. The aircraft came to a complete stop at gate B12. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Immediately, passengers began standing and jostling to remove luggage from the overhead compartment. The usual chaos of deplaning began, people pushing toward the aisle, the flight attendants reminding everyone to be careful of overhead items, the electronic doors opening to reveal the jet bridge beyond. But Marcus didn't move. He waited. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to stay seated or wait, or what the protocol was for this unusual situation. He looked around nervously, wondering if Rodriguez and Kim would come find him, or if he was supposed to navigate to the cockpit on his own. Then Captain Rodriguez appeared from the forward cabin, moving through the crowd of deplaning passengers with easy confidence. Behind him was First Lieutenant Sarah Kim, her blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her flight suit perfectly pressed. Both pilots had removed their flight helmets and held them under their arms. They moved against the flow of human traffic, pushing gently through the aisle toward the middle of the cabin where Marcus sat. Passengers noticed them, recognized their flight suits, and several people stepped back slightly to allow them passage. One elderly gentleman gave Rodriguez a respectful nod. A young man actually said, "Thank you for your service," as they passed by. Rodriguez and Kim acknowledged these comments with brief smiles and nods, but their focus was clearly on Marcus. They arrived at row 12, and both pilots stopped in the aisle in front of Marcus's seat. The cabin had mostly cleared out by this point, but a handful of passengers remained, still gathering their belongings or waiting for the aisle to clear. Everyone in proximity suddenly became very aware of what was about to happen. Phones came up. One passenger started recording video on their cell phone. Then something remarkable occurred. Captain Rodriguez and First Lieutenant Kim both stood up straighter, their posture suddenly becoming formal and military. They brought their right hands up to their foreheads in perfect synchronization, the crisp, precise salute of trained military personnel. It was executed with absolute textbook perfection, the kind of salute that would pass inspection on any military base in the world. Their fingers were straight, their hands angled precisely at their temples, their arms positioned at exactly 45-degree angles to their bodies. "Major Chen, sir," Rodriguez said, his voice steady and formal, his eyes locked on Marcus with deep respect. "Captain Jake Rodriguez, F-22 Raptor pilot, Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada. It is an honor to meet you, sir." Sarah Kim held her salute equally perfectly. "First Lieutenant Sarah Kim, F-22 Raptor pilot, Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada. It is an honor to meet you, sir," she added, her voice equally formal and respectful. Marcus felt his entire world stop. He wasn't sure if he was breathing. His eyes had immediately filled with tears, not the gentle tears from earlier in the flight, but urgent tears that blurred his vision and made his face flush with emotion. He stood up awkwardly from his seat, his legs suddenly unsteady. For a moment, he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. These were younger pilots, junior in rank by career timeline, and yet they were saluting him as if he were their commanding officer. Without conscious thought, Marcus returned the salute, his hand moving to his temple in the military fashion he'd performed thousands of times during his military career. His voice, when he finally found it, trembled slightly. "At ease," he said quietly, using the command that would release them from their formal positions. Both pilots dropped their salutes and relaxed their posture slightly, though they maintained their formal bearing. The emotion on both their faces was evident. This wasn't performance art or empty ritual. They genuinely meant this. "Your contributions to F-22 operations have been substantial and lasting, sir," Rodriguez continued, speaking in the earnest tone of someone delivering a prepared statement that nonetheless carried deep personal conviction. "The protocols you helped develop during your service are still part of our pre-flight procedures. The safety procedures, the tactical formations, the decision-making frameworks, they're all built on the foundation that pilots like you established." Sarah Kim stepped forward slightly. "Every time we take that aircraft up," she said, her voice steady and professional, "we're implementing procedures and systems that were developed and tested by pilots like you, sir. Every mission we fly carries forward the legacy of service members who came before us and sacrificed so that we could have better tools, better training, better systems. Thank you for that sacrifice, sir. Thank you for laying the groundwork." Marcus couldn't respond. His throat was completely closed with emotion. He tried to speak twice and couldn't. His hands were shaking so badly that he clasped them together in front of his chest, trying to maintain some composure. Other passengers who remained on the aircraft had now clearly stopped what they were doing to observe this moment. An older gentleman near the windows was watching with obvious emotion. The flight attendant who'd spoken to Marcus earlier had paused in her duties and was watching with a soft smile on her face. Finally, Marcus managed to find his voice, though it came out rough and fractured. "Thank you," he whispered. Then, louder, "Thank you for carrying on. Thank you for taking what we built and making it better. That's all we ever wanted, to make it better for the next generation." Rodriguez extended his hand and Marcus shook it firmly. The captain's grip was strong and confident, the handshake of a professional pilot. "You've given us a lot to live up to, sir," Rodriguez said simply. Sarah Kim extended her hand next. "We hope we're making you proud," she said quietly. "You are," Marcus replied, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "You absolutely are." They stood there for a moment, the three of them connected by something deeper than words. A shared understanding of what it meant to fly the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, to carry the responsibility of national defense, to be part of a legacy that stretched back decades and would extend decades into the future. Then Rodriguez and Kim excused themselves, stepping aside to allow Marcus to collect his belongings. As they moved toward the jet bridge, they both looked back one more time and nodded, a final gesture of respect that Marcus returned. As Marcus gathered his worn backpack and stood to exit the aircraft, his legs were still shaking. But something fundamental had shifted inside him. He wasn't just a tired single father working warehouse jobs anymore. In this moment, he was also a major in the United States Air Force, a Viper pilot, a man whose service had mattered enough to inspire and guide the next generation. And that changed everything. Marcus stepped into the jet bridge at 8:59 a.m., his worn backpack slung over one shoulder, his aviation manual still clutched in his other hand. The fluorescent lights of the corridor seemed impossibly bright after the dimmer lighting of the aircraft cabin. For a moment, he felt disoriented, as if he'd stepped between two different worlds. Behind him was the aircraft where he'd been invisible. Ahead of him was the airport terminal, a space he'd traversed dozens of times as an invisible man, someone people moved around and passed without acknowledgement. But something was different now. As he emerged into the gate area where passengers were collecting themselves, checking their phones, and preparing to navigate the airport, a woman's voice called out, "Excuse me, Major Chen." Marcus turned, surprised. It was the elderly woman who'd been sitting 2 rows ahead of him on the aircraft. She was probably in her late 70s, with white hair and kind eyes. She was approaching him with a determined expression, moving carefully but with obvious purpose. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, extending her hand warmly. "My father was in the Air Force, Army Air Corps actually, back during World War II. He always said that every generation of military service built on the ones that came before. I think he would have been proud to see what you've done." Marcus shook her hand, genuinely moved. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "Your father's generation did extraordinary things. We all stood on their shoulders." "You're right," the elderly woman agreed. And now these young pilots are standing on yours. That's beautiful, really. Thank you for your service." As she walked away toward baggage claim, Marcus stood there for a moment, processing the interaction. Around him, other passengers were moving through the gate area. And then he noticed something remarkable. People were looking at him. Not with the casual, unconscious glance that people gave to strangers, but with actual recognition and respect. A businessman in an expensive suit approached him. "Major, I wanted to say thank you," he said simply, extending his hand. "I served in the Navy back in the 80s. I know what it means to sacrifice for this country. I appreciate what you've done." Before Marcus could respond adequately, the businessman had already moved on toward the terminal. But then came another person, a young African-American man, probably in his early 30s, wearing business casual attire and carrying a leather briefcase. "Sir, I just wanted to shake your hand," the young man said. "My cousin is military, Army, and he's always talking about how the Air Force sets the standard. Hearing about what you've done, flying one of the most advanced aircraft in the world, that's inspiring, man, really inspiring." Marcus shook his hand, still somewhat stunned by all of this attention. "Tell your cousin thank you for his service," Marcus replied, "and keep supporting him. That means everything." The young man nodded and disappeared into the flow of travelers. By this point, Marcus had realized that Rodriguez and Kim, recognizing what was happening, had deliberately slowed their pace, allowing him to walk through the gate area slightly behind them, so that their presence would draw attention and create a wake of awareness that Marcus could follow into. The two pilots were walking through the terminal, and several airport employees had already recognized their flight suits and were giving them respectful nods. But more importantly, passengers were connecting the dots. They'd heard the announcement, they'd witnessed the salute, and now they were seeing Marcus walk through the gate area with these two active-duty F-22 pilots. The story was clear to anyone paying attention. This was a decorated veteran being honored by the current generation. As Marcus moved from the gate area into the main terminal corridor, the recognition seemed to amplify. A TSA officer in uniform standing near a security checkpoint caught his eye and gave him a small salute. Marcus, surprised, returned it. An elderly couple sitting at a terminal gate called out, "Thank you, Major," as he walked past. A young mother with two small children tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "Are you the pilot?" she asked, her voice filled with childlike wonder. "The one with the special plane?" Marcus knelt down slightly to be at the children's eye level. "Well, I used to fly a very special plane," he said gently. "The F-22 Raptor. Have you heard about it?" Both children shook their heads, their eyes wide with interest. "It's the fastest, most advanced fighter jet in the world," Marcus explained. "It can do things that no other aircraft can do, and it helps protect people all over the world." "That's so cool," the boy, who looked to be about 7, said earnestly. "Did you get to go really, really fast?" Marcus smiled, a genuine smile that felt lighter than any he'd managed in years. "Faster than you could possibly imagine," he said. "Faster than the speed of sound, actually." "Wow," both children exclaimed simultaneously. The mother smiled gratefully at Marcus. "Thank you for that," she said, "and thank you for your service, sir." As Marcus stood and continued walking through the terminal, he felt something shifting in his chest. These interactions weren't perfunctory or performative. People were genuinely grateful. They meant it. And they were seeing him, really seeing him, perhaps for the first time in his life as a veteran. The terminal corridor opened into a broader concourse area. This was the main hub where multiple gates fed into a central area with restaurants, shops, and seating. It was busier here, crowded with travelers from multiple flights. But somehow, that awareness seemed to spread even faster through a larger crowd. A group of teenagers in a school sports uniform, he could see a volleyball logo on their warm-up jackets, suddenly pointed at him as he walked past. One of the girls waved. An airport worker pushing a wheelchair assistance cart gave him a thumbs up. At a coffee stand, a barista looked up from her register and mouthed, "Thank you," across the distance. Rodriguez and Kim had now paused at a seating area, sitting down as if they were waiting for something. But Marcus understood what they were really doing. They were creating a gathering point, a visual reference that drew more attention to the story of this military encounter. A man in his 60s, wearing glasses and a cardigan sweater, approached Marcus directly. "Excuse me, are you Major Marcus Chen?" he asked with obvious uncertainty. "Yes, I am," Marcus replied. "I thought so," the man said with satisfaction. "I was on your flight. I witnessed the salute those young pilots gave you. I want you to know that I found that deeply moving. In this country, sometimes we forget to honor the people who have sacrificed for us. What those pilots did, what you've done, that matters. That's important, and I'm glad I was there to see it." Marcus felt his eyes welling up again. "Thank you for saying that," he managed. "It means more than you know." As the man walked away, Marcus looked around the concourse and realized something profound had happened. He wasn't invisible anymore. The announcement on the aircraft had changed the narrative. The salute had made it public and undeniable. And now, in a bustling airport terminal filled with hundreds of strangers, he was being seen and acknowledged. A young woman approached him with her phone. "Sir, would you mind if I took a picture with you?" she asked shyly. "My grandfather is a veteran, and he's always telling me about the importance of honoring service members. I'd like to show him this." "Of course," Marcus agreed, and they posed together for a selfie, the young woman beaming. As she thanked him and walked away, Marcus stood in the middle of the concourse and took a deep breath. The tired man in the scuffed boots and worn Carhartt jacket was being treated like a hero. And the most remarkable thing was that it didn't feel false or performative. It felt like recognition that had been waiting, patiently, for the right moment to emerge. For the first time in 8 years, Marcus Chen felt truly, genuinely visible. Rodriguez and Kim had guided Marcus away from the main concourse, navigating the bustling airport terminal with the ease of people who traveled through countless military airports. They led him to a quieter gate area that was between flights, where a cluster of comfortable seating remained mostly unoccupied. But before they sat down, Rodriguez suggested they grab coffee. "There's a place nearby that's not too crowded," he said. "We could use some time to actually talk without all the commotion." They found a small cafe tucked into a corner of the terminal, the kind of place that served overpriced airport coffee but offered the advantage of relative privacy. Marcus ordered a black coffee, nothing fancy. Rodriguez got a cappuccino. Sarah chose a chai latte. They settled into a small booth in the back corner, away from the main flow of travelers, where the ambient noise of the airport provided enough background sound to ensure privacy. For a moment, nobody spoke. Rodriguez and Kim sipped their beverages, and Marcus cradled his hot coffee cup, absorbing the warmth through his palms. The emotional intensity of the last few hours had left him somewhat depleted, and he wasn't entirely sure what to expect from this conversation. Were they just going to reminisce about flying, exchange contact information? He found himself holding his breath slightly, waiting for what came next. Sarah Kim was the one who broke the silence. She set down her latte and looked directly at Marcus with an intensity that suggested she'd been thinking about what she wanted to say. "Major," she began, her formal tone softening into something more personal, "we asked you to meet us because we wanted to talk about something important, about your future." Marcus felt his shoulders tense slightly. "My future," he repeated, uncertainty in his voice. "Yes, sir," Rodriguez confirmed, leaning forward slightly. "We've been talking about your situation, and we think there are some significant opportunities that you might not be aware of, opportunities that could change things for you." "What kind of opportunities?" Marcus asked cautiously. He'd learned over the past 8 years not to get his hopes up. Life had a way of disappointing him when he allowed himself to imagine better scenarios. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened her email application. "First," she said, We want to talk about the Air Force Training and Development Program. There's a specific initiative called the Military Mentor and Instructor Corps. It's designed to bring experienced, retired military personnel back into training roles, positions that don't require active flight duty, but that leverage your expertise and experience. She turned her phone toward Marcus so he could see the email she'd pulled up. It was from someone with the title Director of Pilot Training Development at Nellis Air Force Base. The subject line read, "Instructor positions available, F-22 training program." These positions, Rodriguez explained, pay significantly more than you'd expect. They're usually filled by people who left the military 10, 15, 20 years ago. The pay scale is comparable to what active-duty pilots make, sometimes higher depending on the position. The work is meaningful. You'd be training the next generation of F-22 pilots, developing curriculum, mentoring junior officers, and the schedule is much more predictable than flying active missions. Marcus felt his throat tighten. Are you saying there are actual job opportunities, like right now? Not just opportunities, Sarah said, her voice gaining momentum. We've already reached out to Sergeant Major Thompson, the head of the instructor selection program at Nellis. I called him this morning before we landed. I told him about you, about your background, your experience, your call sign. He's interested, very interested. She pulled out a business card and placed it on the table in front of Marcus. It was embossed with military insignia and contained the contact information for Sergeant Major James Thompson, along with his direct phone number and email address. He told me to have you call him, Sarah continued. He said if your background checks out, there's a position opening up in 3 months, training coordinator for the F-22 pilot development program. It comes with housing assistance if you need to relocate to Nevada, full benefits, dental, medical insurance. The works. Marcus stared at the business card as if it might disappear if he looked away. I don't know what to say, he managed. There's more, Rodriguez said, and there was an unusual tenderness in his voice, as if he understood how overwhelming this was becoming. Sarah mentioned scholarships. Can you tell him about that? Sarah nodded. There are multiple organizations associated with the military that provide educational scholarships for the children of service members and veterans. Some of them are incredibly generous. Full rides to universities, vocational training, military academies if your daughters are interested in that path. Given your service record and your current financial situation, your daughters would likely be strong candidates for several of these programs. She pulled up another document on her phone, this one a PDF listing various scholarship opportunities. I took the liberty of downloading information about the ones that seem most relevant to your situation. Full tuition coverage, room and board, stipends for books and supplies. These organizations specifically exist to help families like yours, military families that have faced hardship. Marcus felt tears beginning to form again, but these were different tears. These weren't tears of emotional release or recognition. These were tears of possibility, of hope, of a future that suddenly looked less impossible than it had this morning. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "You don't even know me. You could have just saluted me and moved on." Rodriguez set down his cappuccino and met Marcus's eyes directly. "Because we understand what it means to sacrifice," he said simply. "My father was military. Sarah's mother was military. We've both seen what happens when service members leave the system and fall through the cracks. We've both lost people we care about to that system, people who should have had better outcomes." Sarah continued, "When Rodriguez told me about you, about a pilot who'd given up a promising career to be there for his daughters, who was working 2 jobs to support them, who was still reading F-22 specifications on standby flights, I knew we had to do something. This isn't charity, sir. It's recognition of the fact that you sacrificed. You made a choice that prioritized your family, and that choice came with a cost. We're just trying to acknowledge that cost and help mitigate it going forward." Marcus sat quietly, processing everything they were saying. The coffee in his cup had cooled slightly, but he didn't move to drink it. His hands were trembling too much. "The thing is," Rodriguez said carefully, "you don't have to go back into the military if you don't want to. This isn't about recruiting you back into active service. But if you're interested, these opportunities exist, and you deserve them. Your service deserves to be honored in tangible ways, not just through applause in airport terminals." Sarah leaned forward, her voice becoming more earnest. "What I want you to understand, Major, is that your value doesn't expire. Yes, you can't fly Raptors anymore, your shoulder won't allow it. But your expertise, your knowledge, your judgment, your integrity, those things are evergreen. They don't age out. And the military community needs people like you in positions of mentorship and training." Marcus finally lifted his eyes to meet theirs. "If I called Sergeant Major Thompson," he said slowly, "what would I be getting into?" "An interview," Rodriguez replied immediately. "That's all. An interview where you discuss your background, your capabilities, your interest in the program. And based on that conversation, they determine if you're the right fit. No obligation, just an opportunity to explore." "And my daughters," Marcus asked, "the scholarships?" "We can send you the information today," Sarah said, pulling out her phone again. "You could start the application process immediately. Most of these scholarships have multiple application cycles throughout the year. Given your service record and your daughter's age, you'd likely have several opportunities to apply." Marcus looked at the business card again. Sergeant Major James Thompson, Nelly's Air Force Base. He thought about his daughters, Emma and Sophie. He thought about Sophie's school uniform that was getting too small and he couldn't quite afford to replace. He thought about Emma's dreams of going to a good university someday. He thought about the possibility of working at a base instead of a warehouse, of having a predictable schedule, of being home more often, of being around people who understood military service and sacrifice. "Okay," Marcus said, his voice steadier now. "Okay, I'll call him, I'll look at the scholarships, I'll explore this." Rodriguez smiled, a genuine, warm smile that conveyed real satisfaction. "That's all we're asking, sir. Just give it a chance." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Marcus's hand gently. "You're going to be okay," she said quietly. "More than okay, you're going to be great." And as Marcus held the business card and looked at these two young pilots who'd somehow decided that his future mattered, he allowed himself to believe that she might be right. 6 months later, on a hot Nevada afternoon in mid-July, Major Marcus Chen stood in front of a classroom at Nelly's Air Force Base. The room was state-of-the-art. High-definition screens mounted on every wall, advanced flight simulation equipment visible through an adjacent observation window, and 20 eager young pilots seated in neat rows, their uniforms pressed, their attention focused entirely on him. These were F-22 pilots, current and future. They represented the cutting edge of American military aviation, and they were here to learn from him. His daughters sat in the observation room on the other side of the glass partition. Emma, now 9 years old, was watching her father with undisguised pride. Sophie, 7, was actually paying attention in a way that Marcus found both amusing and touching. They'd been permitted to visit their father's workplace, to see what Major Marcus Chen, training coordinator for the F-22 pilot development program, actually did. For the girls, it was a revelation. Their father wasn't just the tired man who worked 2 jobs and struggled to make ends meet. He was someone important, someone respected, someone who mattered. Marcus clicked a remote control, and the first slide appeared on the massive screen behind him. It showed a diagram of the F-22 Raptor's integrated avionics system, one of the most complex pieces of technology ever developed. His salary had tripled since that fateful morning on Flight 237. He had full medical and dental insurance, something he hadn't experienced in 8 years. His housing was subsidized through the base. His daughters attended the military-affiliated school on base, which offered significantly better educational opportunities than their previous public school. And most importantly, he had stability, predictability. a schedule that allowed him to actually be present in his daughter's lives. "Good afternoon," Marcus began, his voice calm and commanding, the voice of someone who'd spent thousands of hours delivering critical information to highly trained military personnel. "Today, we're going to discuss decision-making under extreme pressure, using real-world scenarios that I personally experienced during active F-22 operations." He clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of himself in full flight gear, standing in front of an F-22 Raptor taken during his active service days. The pilot in the photograph looked invincible, confident, at the peak of his career. The pilots in the classroom straightened slightly, their eyes widening with renewed interest. This wasn't just an instructor reading from a manual. This was someone who'd actually lived the content they were being taught. "I want to tell you about a combat training scenario that went sideways," Marcus continued, "and how my team responded when our primary systems failed at altitude." For the next 45 minutes, Marcus delivered a masterclass in tactical decision-making, systems management, and crisis response. He spoke with the authority of someone who'd been there, who'd faced life-and-death situations in the cockpit, who understood the millisecond-by-millisecond choices that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The pilots took notes frantically. One young woman in the third row leaned forward, hanging on his every word. A male pilot in the back row nodded repeatedly, clearly recognizing similar scenarios from his own training. When Marcus concluded the session, one of the pilots raised his hand. "Sir, how did you manage the psychological pressure during that situation? The manual talks about stress management, but this sounds like it was beyond standard protocols." Marcus smiled, a genuine smile that reflected how much he enjoyed these interactions. "That's an excellent question," he said. "And honestly, it comes down to training and trust. You train so extensively that your responses become automatic. When systems fail, you don't panic because you've already visualized the failure scenario hundreds of times. And you trust your wingman, your support systems, your training. That trust is what keeps you alive." He paused, looking directly at the young pilot. "And sometimes," he added quietly, "you have to trust that life will put you exactly where you're supposed to be, even if the path to get there is unconventional." The class ended at 4:30. As the pilots filed out, several stopped to shake Marcus's hand or ask follow-up questions. This was routine now, pilots seeking his insights, wanting to learn from his experience, treating him with the respect due to someone whose service had been exemplary. Captain Jake Rodriguez appeared in the classroom doorway as the last pilot was leaving. Behind him was First Lieutenant Sarah Kim. They were in flight suits, just returning from a training mission. When they saw Marcus, both pilots smiled warmly. "Major," Rodriguez greeted him formally, though there was obvious affection in his voice. "How was the class?" "Excellent," Marcus replied. "These pilots are sharp. You should be proud of the quality of people coming through the program." "We are," Sarah said, approaching to shake his hand. "And a lot of that is because of you, sir. The curriculum changes you've implemented have been making a real difference in pilot performance metrics." Over the past 6 months, Marcus had done far more than just teach classes. He'd worked with the training development team to update flight protocols, enhance simulation scenarios, and create more realistic decision-making frameworks. His contributions had actually improved pilot performance in measurable ways. Performance reviews from students consistently praised his ability to translate real-world experience into practical training. But beyond the professional achievements, something else had transformed in Marcus's life. As Rodriguez and Kim left to file their post-flight reports, Marcus walked to the observation window where his daughters were waiting. Emma immediately pressed her hands against the glass and waved. Sophie did the same, both girls beaming with pride. That evening, after picking up Emma and Sophie from the base school, Marcus drove them to their favorite pizza restaurant, something he could afford to do now without anxiety about his budget. As they sat in a booth eating pepperoni pizza, Emma looked at her father with admiration in her eyes. "Dad," she said, "are you going to fly jets again?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. "My shoulder won't let me do that anymore. But I'm doing something just as important. I'm teaching other pilots how to fly them safely and successfully. I'm helping protect people." "That's cool," Emma said matter-of-factly. Then after a pause she added, "I'm proud of you, Dad." Sophie nodded enthusiastically, her mouth full of pizza. "Me too." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. These were the moments that mattered. His daughters knew who he was now. They understood that their father had served his country with honor and that he continued to serve in meaningful ways. They weren't ashamed of him for working warehouse jobs. They were proud of him for never giving up, for making sacrifices to be present in their lives, for ultimately finding a way to honor both his calling and his love for his family. 2 weeks later, Marcus received an email notification that both Emma and Sophie had been accepted to the Armed Forces Scholarship Program. Full tuition coverage through university, room and board, and educational stipends. His daughters would have opportunities he'd never dared imagine for them. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his modest but comfortable government housing on base, looking at photographs on his phone. There was the one from the airport terminal where he was shaking hands with a TSA officer. There was one of Rodriguez and Kim saluting him on the aircraft. There was one of him standing in front of the classroom full of young pilots. And there was one of Emma and Sophie, beaming with pride, standing in front of an F-22 Raptor with their father in his flight suit. He pulled out the worn aviation manual that had started this entire journey, the F-22 Raptor Technical Specifications Guide that had caught Rodriguez's eye on that fateful flight. He opened it to a page he'd marked years ago, back when he was struggling to hold onto his identity. He'd written something in the margin in faded pen. "Call sign, Viper. Never forget who you are." Marcus smiled. He hadn't forgotten, but more importantly, he'd remembered, and in remembering, he'd rebuilt. His call sign wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a living legacy. Every pilot he trained carried forward the protocols and wisdom he'd developed. Every mission they flew represented the continuation of his service. Every life they protected was, in some small way, an extension of his sacrifice. Marcus Chen had gone from being an invisible man in a worn Carhartt jacket, ignored in airport terminals and warehouse break rooms, to someone whose expertise shaped the future of American aviation. But more than that, he'd gone from being a man defined by his failures and compromises to someone who understood that sacrifice, properly recognized and honored, could transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone he touched. The poor single dad in seat 12F wasn't poor anymore, not in spirit, not in purpose, not in the richness of what his life had become. He was Viper, and he was rising higher than he'd ever flown. The end.